5 years had passed. Nicolette sat on a rock on the beach, rubbing her belly and watching two little girls play in the sand. She glanced at Edward hesitantly. "Do you think this time it'll be a boy, or will we have another girl?" she asked. "Maybe we'll have 4 prophetess daughters, like Philip the Evangelist," Edward replied cheerfully. But when he saw that his wife didn't laugh, he took her hands and looked into her eyes intently. "I'm absolutely certain we'll have a son one day, and honestly, I don't care if it's this time or later. God has brought us through fire and given us so much that I, for one, am truly grateful and content. And I'd be grateful even if we had 7 little girls." Nicolette looked into his eyes and then smiled. Edward sat beside her and pulled her close. "I feel a bit like I'm in a dream today," he said, looking at her. "This is the scene from my vision, back when I was about 25. I waited 7 long years before I first saw you, and several more for this vision to come true. I hinted at it once, but you should know this was the scene, this exact conversation. For me, this vision was a source of hope. Back in prison, I clung to the phrase, 'God brought us through fire,' but I was also a bit confused when I found out who you were." "Who I am," Nicolette repeated. "I think I only figured that out with you." Then she changed the subject. "In a few weeks, a new president will be elected. Do you think it'll be you again? Have you thought about what's next if it's not?" Edward smiled. "I'm still praying for God's guidance. I don't think God always works this way, but sometimes he leaves things to the last minute. And that's fine with me. I'm not standing at the pillory, not hearing the scourge crack through the air. In recent years, we've traveled back and forth, and I think you deserve to spend a peaceful winter in this house with our new child." The little girl Nicolette gave birth to a few weeks later was named Angeline, and Nicolette later saw the name as a grim foreshadowing. They were granted only a few short weeks together, and Nicolette herself chose a spot in the garden where they buried little Angeline. "I hope this is the right place you saw in your dream," Nicolette said sadly, "because I want to rest beside her one day." That day, however, didn't come for another 60 years. Edward and Nicolette had 4 more children, 3 sons and another daughter, all of whom reached adulthood. Then, on that day, when Nicolette finally left this earth, her own messenger, an angel whose name bore that meaning, waited for her at the gates of heaven. Edward couldn't fathom how 65 years had passed so quickly. In 1789, when he proposed to Nicolette, those 65 years together would have seemed like an eternity. As clods of earth fell onto the coffin in a remote corner of the garden, the old lion made his way to where their story began, to the bench on the beach. It had, of course, been repaired and replaced several times over the years, but the new bench stood in the same spot, serving as a marker of time for him. Looking at it, he felt how long ago it all was. For the 5th time, he whispered softly, "I'd like to kneel once more and give thanks for everything." He knelt in the sand before the bench but said nothing. He didn't think it right to speak to the dead. He simply gazed at the bench for a long time, silently recalling the days when it wasn't empty. After a moment, he turned and called to one of his great-grandsons playing on the beach, 8-year-old Samuel, and asked him to help him stand. "Sit down, Samuel," he requested. "I'd like to give you something to remember me by. You're the youngest of all my grandsons, and I want to give this item to you, so it can be passed down through the centuries. It's 1854, and you'll likely live to see the next century." Edward reached into his pocket and took out a cufflink. "Do you know what this is?" Samuel shrugged. "Some kind of button. This is one of the cufflinks I was wearing back in 1789 when they were about to publicly scourge me in the square. A soldier tore my shirt, splitting this cufflink in 2. That was the day I became the first president of this country, and I was reminded once again that God is faithful and his promises always hold true. Nothing happened to me. When the soldier was about to strike, a gunshot rang out, his hand flinched in surprise, and I barely felt a thing. Moments later, I was president." Edward pressed the cufflink into Samuel's hand and continued, "Among our ancestors is the famous Nicholas Renard, from both my line and your great-grandmother's. Thanks to him, a living faith has been passed down through our family for generations. You know, Nicholas Renard died in 1731, and my mother, as a very young girl, was at his funeral. Imagine, she met someone born in 1646, though she didn't remember it. That's a long time ago. And here I am, telling you about it, someone who might live to see 1920. Edward gazed thoughtfully at the sea. None of us should live off the memory of what our ancestors accomplished or who we knew. That should only inspire and encourage us. It's like a torch we pass along. This cufflink is a reminder that I had such faith. And I hope that when you're old, you'll be able to tell someone else about the faith you had, perhaps in that unknown, distant 20th century. Samuel nodded. He carefully tucked the cufflink into his pocket. He didn't yet grasp the weight of the moment, but he knew it meant something to his great-grandfather. He was nearly 80 when, in 1926, he handed the cufflink to the director of a small museum newly opened in the capital city of Rouge. You know, I'm not sure I'm doing the right thing by giving it to you, Samuel said thoughtfully. Edward Sandcreek might have preferred if I'd found some young boy, told him about all I've experienced with God, and given him the cufflink as a torch of faith. But it's the 20th century, and this cufflink was worn by our first president in 1789 on the day he was elected. It's a historical artifact, so, despite some doubts, I'm passing it to you. How long did Edward Sandcreek actually live? Asked the museum director's son, standing beside his father. Samuel Sandcreek smiled. Great-grandfather's story didn't end in 1854 by a long shot. When his wife, with whom he spent 65 years, passed away, he felt a bit lonely. So, he decided to end his life on the mission field. He was 97 at the time. He went to South America, where he spent 3 more years as a preacher and missionary. God worked many miracles through him there. Then Edward Sandcreek decided he wanted to see home one last time. He returned to the island shortly before his 100th birthday, and a grand celebration was held. Great-grandfather wouldn't let anyone give him gifts. He didn't know how much time he had left, but at that celebration, money was raised for a new school to be built in South America. Samuel Sandcreek blinked several times as the young man listened thoughtfully. He lived a few more months, passing away in January 1858, shortly after the new year. I was 12, and I remember his funeral vividly. It was only then that his words about passing faith like a torch began to sink in. The director placed the cufflink in a small display case dedicated to the first president and paused at the door. From one room, Nicholas Renard gazed at him from a painting, and from another, Edward Sandcreek, 2 men who chose to heed Christ's call and built their lives on the rock, not the sand, despite one of their names containing that word. The young man then set out on a long walk to the cemetery, but he didn't find the first president's gravestone there. Edward rested beside the one he loved, beside the first and last Queen of Lupe des Seine, who bore the title for only a few days but stood happily by her husband's side for decades. So, the young man stopped at another grave, where, generations earlier, that spark of faith had first been lit. His name was Nathaniel Renard, and he knew well whose name he carried through the centuries. At Nicholas Renard's gravestone, he noticed a small seashell lying in the dust, picked it up, and put it in his pocket. "A torch," he said softly. "Mine is just starting to burn, and I won't let it ever go out. I know sometimes the lions open their jaws, and it often feels like you come to shut them at the last moment, but I want to trust that I can always rely on your promises, because you are the Lion of Judah, both lion and lamb, Lord over every lion, over every situation and every lord. Because of you, we can walk forward with our heads held high and roar boldly like those lions." The sky glowed red with the sunset. Over the small island off France, the sun was setting, but what burned on through the night were those metaphorical torches. The faith that had burned through the centuries in the countless hearts of the members of a family renowned for their devotion was the most important inheritance the long-departed Count Renard passed on to his many descendants. It was the most enduring part of Nicholas's legacy. Such torches of faith still burn all around us, and unlike Nicholas Renard and Edward Sandcreek, they are not fictional. Yet at times, there seem to be painfully few truly unshakable people around. How wonderful it would be not to have to invent such characters, but instead to look to real stories and real people who once raised their own torch of faith. When I look at my own family's history, I find no such person. But I know I can become one. Just as Edward Sandcreek could never meet the man from his vision, yet could strive to become him, for that man was his future. The destiny, or rather, the calling, that I gave Edward with my pen may seem slightly exaggerated, or perhaps not. As I mentioned at the beginning, Edward Sandcreek borrows a few traits from my favorite preacher, Dan Mohler. He once told a story about his grandfather, who lived to be 99. I can easily picture 100-year-old Dan Mohler pulling on a running shirt, going out for a jog, and then stepping up to the pulpit with a joyful smile. Honestly, I would be more surprised if that didn't happen than if it did. And so, I allowed myself to send Edward Sandcreek on a missionary journey at nearly 100 years old, to end his life in a way worthy of a great old lion. When I finished writing these lines, I heard Dan Mohler, probably around 63 at this point, say, "Watch out for me in 40 years, for I'll still be here." I don't know if that was a prophecy or simply a healthy mindset, but if it turns out to be true, then I've actually underestimated the final years of Edward Sandcreek, the man he helped inspire. In any case, this book is meant to encourage. The path of the righteous is like the light of dawn, shining ever brighter until the full day, Proverbs 4 verse 18, and although at 97 we may no longer be running the race of faith, we can still envision a future where our hearts do not fade like a dying ember. However late in life our fire may die down, the point is that it should shine more brightly at the end than at the beginning, and that, before we go, we should light a few more torches along the way.